Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. In today's episode, we're going to talk about pronunciations. And we're going to cover all different kinds of pronunciations. The main focus here is to help your narrator to get the pronunciations to be correct according to the way that you would like your audiobook to be. But there are a lot of different ways to approach what is correct. So let's dive into that now. First of all, let's talk about names. Names can be factual, historical, or they can be fictional. And the approach to the pronunciation differs based on which category those names fall into. If the names are actual, are historical, or whether they are well-known versus somebody that you as the author knows, these are also different levels of need to know and how to find. If, for example, you're thanking your best friend in the acknowledgments, and they have a very complicated, difficult name, and if you're not going to read your acknowledgments, then obviously it won't matter. But for, let's say, for example, you're reading a memoir and you are using real names in that memoir, then your narrator is going to need to know how to pronounce those names. Now, if the people that you're naming are not well enough known, whereby your narrator could go to YouTube, for example, and find their name said properly for that specific person, or to some pronunciation website because the person is really well known or a celebrity or something, then you really have to provide that information for them. There are cases where, let's say you're doing a memoir and you've only had written communication with somebody, so you may not know how to pronounce their name correctly. And they may not be somebody who is well enough known that a narrator could find their pronunciation online. Then the best thing to do, and what I'd recommend, is that you or your narrator do some research to find a name that looks like maybe it's somebody else, but maybe they have the same name or the same last name. If that's the one that looks more challenging to pronounce, same first name, likewise. So that way you're getting the most reasonable approximation of how that person may have pronounced their name. However, in situations like this where, again, the name is not familiar or is not famous enough to provide the information online for a narrator to find the pronunciation, in these circumstances, if you do know the pronunciation, then it is really up to you to provide that pronunciation. You can deliver that, and I recommend this, deliver that through a short audio file that is very easily recorded on your phone, and you can just send the audio file to your narrator or your audiobook producer. If the name is somebody who may have been interviewed online, that might be on YouTube, for example, then somebody, one of either you as the author or the narrator, should do the research to try to find the correct pronunciation of the name. And for any of these things that I'm recommending that somebody, either author or narrator or producer, do this kind of research, I want to throw it out there to you authors that you have the option to help, or you're kind of leaving it into the category of hope. You can either help or you can hope. And I would encourage you to help if you can. You may find as well that since you're the author and you've done your research to create the manuscript in the first place, that you may have a much better maybe more accurate set of resources than a narrator may have readily available to them or that they may know about. Let's move on to fictional names. These can be within the context of a nonfiction book, so it's not so much what your genre is as it is what these names are. If you're making up names for characters or to represent people in your book, then if it matters to you how those names are pronounced, then it's very important that you communicate that information to your narrator. Don't assume. I'm going to give you an example. It's one of my favorite examples because there are so many different versions of pronouncing this name, and I have a friend who is very particular about the particular way in which we pronounce it for her. The name is spelled Andrea. 4 potential pronunciations right off the bat are Andrea, 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 Andrea. There are probably more different ways to say that, like putting the stress on the final syllable. In any case, these 4 are all very common ways of pronouncing that same name. If in your manuscript it matters to you which version your narrator uses, then you obviously need to communicate that to them. And it's really important to do it at the very beginning, before they start recording. If you don't tell them, they're going to make a guess. They might think to ask you, if they even think of asking you. And the reason I say it that way is because maybe they only know one person with that name, and they always say it, Andrea, for example. But you want it Andrea. If you wait until they've recorded it all, and that name appears many times in your audiobook, then you've got a situation where, first of all, a lot more time is having to be put into the production of the audiobook. And secondly, the quality of the audiobook is almost certainly going to suffer to a degree because the more pickups, the more corrections that you have in an audio, the more opportunities for levels to not match accurately, or the slight variant on the tone of voice may not match. Our voices change from day to day, hour to hour. So it's more likely that you're going to have a flow of your audiobook that's not going to be as good as it could have been if you'd simply taken care of that one item at the front end. If, on the other hand, you have a name like that, but you're not attached to which way it is pronounced, then that's fine. And you may want to even let your narrator know it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent throughout the book. And then this next little tidbit I want to share really applies to actual names and also to some of the things we'll talk about a little later in the episode. But I just want to also make this really clear. If you don't know the correct pronunciation for a name, it is not preferred that you make a guess, unless the situation is where you are not able to find that name, where they're a lesser known name and you have an idea of how you think it probably is pronounced. In that case, that's okay to make a guess because somebody will have to make the guess. It could be you or the narrator. But in a situation where you're asked about the pronunciation of a name or a word, if you don't know, it's much, much, much better to say, I don't know, than to give a pronunciation and possibly have it be wrong. It would be better for the narrator, if it falls to them, to do that research and get it correct, than for you to be the voice of authority when, in fact, you don't know the answer to how it is pronounced. Let's take a short break, and we'll be right back. Here at Pro Audio Voices, we love working with authors who have a big goal in mind. They really want to reach out to their audience around the world. We're here to help make that happen. It starts with our pre-production process. where we're evaluating and determining what elements of the audiobook we can leverage to both create an excellent listener experience for your listeners, as well as drawing them to your website to engage with you further. It continues on through the production process, making decisions that will enhance and support your big goals, as well as creating a great listener experience. But we don't stop there. Once the audiobook is live, we move on to helping you market your audiobook with the Audiobook Marketing Program. Come check us out at proaudiovoices.com. To schedule a call to talk about your audiobook project, click on Get Started. Okay, now let's talk about some things that maybe are a little more nuanced, and also some ways to search for those pronunciations when you're looking for them for factual people. Okay, so the first thing is about foreign words. One of the trickiest things about foreign words is deciding whether you want them to be pronounced as the native person speaking that language would pronounce them, or if you would like them Americanized, basically, or Britishized, as the average American or Englishman would pronounce them, or, frankly, any other nationality. Let's say, for example, you are an author who lives in South Africa. You're a South African author, so you personally speak with a native South African accent. Let's say that your audiobook is being narrated in general American accent. All of that works, but the question will be, with any words that are South African, do you want them pronounced the way you would say them, or the way an American might say them? And that is a subtle difference. And I think that really you can go either way with it, but you want to think through that decision and the justification for your decision so that you're clear and your narrator is clear. If you two are clear, then your audience is likely to be clear as well and to be fine with whichever choice you make. Now let's jump into how you do this research to find the pronunciations that you're looking for. For actual factual names of people, I most often will look on YouTube, and usually that search will turn up a lot of things that may not be particularly helpful. There are a lot of videos on YouTube where, for example, they may talk about a person, but they just use music and text slides, and that's no help at all. However, if you can find an interview where someone introduces the guest and says their name, you know that it's going to be right because any smart interviewer is going to ask for the correct pronunciation before they start the video. And if they screw up, you know that the person who's there is most likely going to correct them. Either way, you'll get what you need. If the person is still alive and active and is well known, then that task should be pretty easy these days. If they're an historical figure, then it will be harder, and you may want to actually listen to more than one person pronounce their name if you're listening to YouTube videos, because not all people who post YouTube videos are doing the research to find the proper pronunciation of somebody's name, which means you need to pay attention to what your sources are for those pronunciations. If the person has a YouTube channel, that can be particularly easy because they are likely to have a video on their own YouTube where they introduce themselves. Some pronunciations can be found through sources like Wikipedia, where they actually will phonetically spell out the name, and just doing an online search where you're putting in that person's name and making sure that whoever comes up in your search is actually the same person. Again, because there are, many people obviously with the exact same name, but they sometimes will pronounce their names differently, partly depending on their nationality, but for any other number of reasons, like the Andrea situation. People have their preferences on the way their own names are pronounced. Sometimes for names, proper names, but also for many, many different words, you have a lot of different sources. There are several YouTube channels where they just focus on how to pronounce different words. Programs or channels like Emma Saying is a source. What you want to make sure, though, is that when you go to a source that you're not just getting a computer-generated voice. And you can usually tell. It's pretty clear when, it just sounds like a computer. Never trust those. I mean, sure, computers are smart, but are you really going to trust them on how to pronounce words? I am not. And I suggest that you also not trust them for that. And then the other category of pronunciations is really based on regional dialects. And these are often things that we don't need to address necessarily, but you should be aware of them. And if they matter to you, then you want to make sure that your narrator knows. And these are words, just as an example, the word route can be pronounced route or root. And depending on which part of the country you're from, you're likely going to lean into one of those. If it matters, then you definitely want to let your narrator know. If it doesn't, then what matters is consistency throughout the narrative. And to sum up what we covered today, first of all, names, are they factual or are they fictional? If they're factual, then you want to try to find the correct pronunciation. If they're fictional, then make sure if you have a preference on how they're pronounced, then you want to make sure your narrator knows. One other little thing that I'm just realizing I didn't specifically cover, and that is made-up words. So in a lot of sci-fi fantasy, or even sci-fi, will have fictionalized words, cool gadgets and such that you've made up. Be sure to communicate how you would like those pronounced. Even if they look like they might be really easy to figure out, it's best to double check with your narrator and make sure that they are seeing the word the same way that you intended it. We talked about whether you want to help with finding pronunciations or whether you want to just hope that the narrator gets it right, and making sure also that your narrator is well prepared going into the recording process. And then also accented or foreign words, how do you want them treated? Do you want them said as if they were from a speaker of that native language, or spoken as if by the person in the same accent of the narrator? So lots of different things to think about in terms of pronunciations. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions about audiobook production or marketing, please reach out to us at proaudiovoices.com. We're here to help you have the greatest impact you can and to help your great story come alive. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.